Cool. So for this session on creating languages, we're joined by David J. Peterson, who's an American linguist and language creator. David's best known for creating the Dothraki and Valyrian languages for the HBO series Game of Thrones, and I'm probably going to mispronounce the names of these languages, the Castathan and Erathiant languages for Sci-Fi's Defiance. Have I got that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And you've been creating languages since 2000. So in 2007, you co-founded the Language Creation Society with 9 other language creators. So I thought I might just jump in. I think the sort of most interesting starting point is looking at the Dothraki language. Maybe I'll just read a little bit about, I think this was from the Language Creation wiki page about Dothraki. So Dothraki is the language of the nomadic horse warriors who populate the Dothraki Sea, a vast grass plain in the center of the continent of Essos, which lies to the east of Westeros across the Narrow Sea. And of course, we're talking about the world in George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones universe. And the Dothraki language differs greatly from the common tongue of Westeros and the languages of the Free Cities, which descend from High Valyrian. So I suppose I'm interested in the process by which you were actually asked to create this language, and also sort of your starting points in sort of figuring out how to construct it and the way that it would relate to perhaps other real-world languages and the other languages inside of this George R.R. Martin's universe.
All right. So I started, of course, when in order to create the Dothraki language, what happened is that there was a competition amongst language creators to see who would get the job that was put on by the Language Creation Society. And so I was one of about 30 or so conlangers to apply. The first round, it was judged in 2 rounds, the first round by other language creators and then the second round by the producers. And I was the one that made it through both rounds, so that was how I got to do that. As for the language itself, it was based entirely on the very small number of words that were present in the first 3 books of the Song of Ice and Fire series. So, you know, I started there. I had to figure out, first of all, what I thought the phonological structure of the words was, based on how they were spelled and how I thought fans would think they were pronounced and how they could plausibly be pronounced for something that was supposed to be a foreign language, of course. And then there were a few phrases that had, you know, bits of grammar. Basically, anytime you put 2 words together, there's grammar there. So I had to figure out everything that was already present there to make sure that I didn't contradict anything that was in the book, so that it would all stay grammatical once I was done. And then once I had once I had done that, I was free to continue creating the language as I saw fit. So.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of taking what George R.R. Martin had already created in the first 3 books, firstly, did that provide any kind of structure for the language? And secondly, were there actually any mistakes, or was George R.R. actually adhering to some kind of structure that he'd already come up with? Or was it basically just a bunch of sort of words that he dropped in?
Well, he claims that it was just a bunch of words that he dropped in, but really, for every single exemplar where there was a multi-word expression, it adhered to a grammatical structure that was consistent. Specifically, that was consistent of head initial languages. That is, languages where the verb will come before the object, where the noun will come before the adjective, where nouns will come before the relative clauses, where possessors will come after the nouns that they modify, and where there will be prepositions as opposed to postpositions. All of those things were, well, most of those things were present in the book in one form or another. So, for example, with expressions like where they were saying rach, 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 haj, a boy, a strong boy, the simplest explanation for that phrase is that the adjective comes after the noun. So once you know that, then you look at the other expressions that exist. For example, like there was the Sorefoot King, the Cart King, and in all those examples they matched exactly, where the main word came first and the modifiers came afterwards. For the one sentence or full sentence that existed, a prince rides inside me, it started with the subject, and then there was the verb, and then the object came afterwards, and the object was separable fairly obviously into preposition and pronoun. So it all lined up perfectly. There were no mistakes, which I was quite surprised by, because most of the time with fantasy and sci-fi authors, they just haven't got a solid clue what they're doing at all.
Mm. I've got a question from someone who's fairly familiar with Mongolia, and when I was sort of reading up on how you constructed the language, I think it was in a New York Times piece, was saying that you found inspiration in the structure of Swahili, Estonian, Turkish, Russian, and a few other languages. But so the question that was posed to me was, the Dothraki people are perhaps in some way similar to people living in Mongolia. So are there similarities between the Dothraki language that you've constructed and the Mongolian language?
There will be similarities, but they'll be superficial.
Yeah,
I mean, there's similarities between Dothraki and every language on the planet, because there's only so many ways that languages can vary. And yeah, for example, with that, we came up with that for the what do you call it? The press announcement. What's the word for that? Press release. We came up with that for the press release for Dothraki. It was not technically a lie, but really, the truth was, if Dothraki was inspired by anything, it would have been inspired, or parts of it would have been inspired by 3 languages that I created, and those languages in turn were originally inspired by, like, for example, Turkish, Swahili, and Nuktitut, and so forth. There was the direct, influences from natural languages were so minimal as to really just be non-noteworthy. Like, for example, in Russian, in the genitive plural for feminine nouns, you form it by actually removing the final vowel of the noun. And I thought that was neat, because usually the nominative singular is the most simplex form of the noun in a case system. Or it's the easiest form of the noun, just the one that you put at the front of the sentence. And in this case, in Russian, the simplest form is this kind of bizarre other form. And so I thought that was neat, and so I did a similar thing with Dothraki, not with the genitive plural, with the accusative of inanimate nouns. But anyway, so little things like that would have influenced language. But other than that, no, it was an exaggeration, to say the least. Now, as for Mongolian, Mongolian is a Turkic language, very much in style. So it's very much a head-final language, which is kind of the opposite of Dothraki. It does have cases, but it has Turkic style cases, and it has a vowel harmony system, which is really interesting, because the ways that the vowels used to harmonize, they don't harmonize that way anymore, but you still have to do it, which makes it really interesting for a vowel harmony system. Very difficult. Yeah, the language didn't directly inspire Dothraki, but the culture did, because when George R. R. Martin was creating the Dothraki people, he based them on kind of like a smattering of Native American cultures, but primarily on the Mongolian culture of Genghis Khan's era during the Silk Road period. And so then when I was fleshing out the vocabulary for Dothraki, I would go and look up articles on what the climate was like in Mongolia, throughout the course of the year. What type of plants and animals they had a regular interaction with, how they lived in gurs, what life was like in a gur, what life was like being a nomad in Mongolia, and then what life was like during the era of Genghis Khan. And so that influenced the type of words that were ported into Dothraki. In addition to a friend of mine was actually in the Peace Corps in Mongolia for 3 years. He just got back. So his experiences influenced me a lot. Like, for example, he was the one who told me about how in Mongolian there are 2 different words for animal dung, depending on whether it's soft or hard. because you use the hard animal dung for fuel, for the fire inside of your gur.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very interesting, and it obviously makes sense that you'd want to distinguish between the two, because in Mongolia they'll stockpile the hard animal dung, but nobody's going picking up soft animal dung. That's disgusting. Yeah.
In terms of how broad the language is, I know that you can pick up living language guides on Dothraki. So there's books, there's courses now, and I kind of went through a few. And there was again, like it was in the New York Times, I think. It was a dating guide in Dothraki, and there's also a guide to getting around New York. And so they kind of translated common phrases and then found the equivalent that you could construct in Dothraki. So there was one which was something about catching the F train in New York, and the equivalent was, does it ride this metallic lizard with a name that begins with the F sound? Which obviously makes sense that you wouldn't have a word for train in Dothraki, but how broad is the language that you've created? I mean, if you're constructing languages at the rate that you're constructing them, you can't obviously construct languages that have thousands and thousands of words each time. But sort of, how many kind of words have you constructed in Dothraki, and how flexible is it as an actual language that you can use?
Well, let's try out one of these little gadgets.
Sorry, like a sub-question. Are you still creating it, actively creating it as
of course.
sort of seasons go on?
Yeah. Okay, all right. So, now I'm going on. Okay, I'm gonna try out one of these gadgets here.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Can you see this?
Great. I can.
All right, here you go. Yeah. So you asked how big the Dothraki language is.
Mm-hmm.
This is the whole thing. I mean, so this is the grammar. There's a lot of that stuff. Here we get to the words. So here's how many words there are. Can you actually make out those numbers?
Yeah. So a total of 904 stems and 3,805 words.
Yeah. So that's where we're at now. And so then this is the Dothraki to English side of the dictionary, which is the largest chunk of this document. It goes on for a bit. Let's see. That's a good word. I thought that was a funny word for child. I don't know. It sounds stupid. Now, this is a cool word. Yamori, a male youth who's come of age. I forgot I created that word. That's cool. Anyway, and then, what was it? This is the, this is the English to Dothraki side. We can see is much simpler. What you'd expect in a little dictionary you'd pick up. And so let's see how big we're at. We got 2 Z words. I don't know. Z isn't a very popular letter in English, but that comes out to 315 pages. So that's where we're at right now for the Dothraki language. That's how big it is. But of course, it's only for the stuff that's canon. It's only going to be words that make sense within the fictional context.
Mm-hmm.
of the Song of Ice and Fire. So it's like, you can create words for whatever you want in the modern world. They won't actually be a part of the fictional version of the language, I guess. And if that's the official version of language, they won't be a part of the official version of language. But, it's a language. Anybody can use it. So if you come up with a word that makes sense for television in Dothraki and start using it, then, there it is. But yeah, it's basically... So that's basically the language at this point, and yeah, I do keep adding to it. I would love for all languages I created to have about 10,000 words, because that's about the size of the vocabulary that you'll command if you go through an entire college course, like from intro to expert, in a foreign language. At the end of that, you have about 10,000 words of vocabulary in whatever language you've studied. So I'd love for there to be that many words in all the languages I've created. It takes time, but I'll be alive for at least 20 more years. So.
What's the language that you've created that has the most words
Oh,
so far?
Dothraki. Dothraki,
Dothraki. And
actually.
that's just because you've got the most time to build it out?
Kind of. I mean, like my previous largest was one of my own languages called Kamakawi. But then once Dothraki came along, I did still work on Kamakawi for a bit, but that took up most of my time. But then at the time that I started working on Game of Thrones, that was the only show I was working on. So I pretty much spent all my time just working on beefing up the vocabulary of Dothraki. Then when Defiance came along, suddenly I was doing 2 languages for that, and then like the season after that in Game of Thrones, I was starting to work on High Valyrian. The project started to pile up, and so like if you look at the word counts of my languages chronologically, you'll see that they get smaller and smaller and smaller, despite the fact that I'm coining more and more words every single year that I work, if you take all languages combined. But even so, I mean, there's going to be a time where all of this comes to an end, and then I'll just have plenty of time to beef up the vocabularies and get them to where I want them to be.
What sort of contact have you had with George R.R. Martin in constructing both of the languages for the TV show?
Well, I've had contact with him, but he's never given me any input on creating the languages. He was never really interested in that. He's happy that they exist, and so I give him translations when he asks for them. But he's never created any words beyond the first ones. We'll see if a new book comes out and he decides to create a word. I'll have to find a way to make it work. But other than that, I mean, that's the extent of his involvement, because he's focused primarily on finishing the series.
I'm kind of interested in this idea that people are picking up constructed languages as perhaps secondary languages. Not many, but from what I can see, the most popular constructed languages that are actually spoken as perhaps secondary languages are Esperanto, Interlingua, and Klingon. And I thought Klingon was perhaps the more interesting one there, because that is constructed for a fictional universe, while the first 2 are constructed for the real world. And I also found it interesting because, as I was saying before, the Living Language series has released a Dothraki book and language learning guide. Are many people picking it up to speak it, and why are they doing it? Is it just kind of fun, or are there actually groups of people that are using your language sort of in the real world in any way?
Well, there's the fan site, Dothraki.org. They seem to be pretty. There are several of them that are pretty good with it. And then I think that there are probably other people picking it up now. It's probably easier with Living Language Dothraki. Nice to have an official source, but I don't know. Everybody has a different reason for doing stuff. I think it's when it comes to learning languages, I think learning languages is just fun. So that's what I do with my free time. Right now, I'm learning Japanese, and that's really what I do with my reading time. I just read teacher self-guides or language reference grammars, just because that's what I like to do. As for anybody learning Dothraki, part of it is just going to be just to learn some stuff because they're fans of the show, which is cool. Maybe some people just want to get a tattoo in it, which is cool. People want to converse with each other. That's cool too. It's all good.
What's the best Dothraki tattoo that you've seen?
Well, there have been some good ones. I think the one I liked the best were 2 sisters. They each got the same tattoo that said "Je clay clay," which is blood of my blood. Which means that they're related, and I thought that was cool.
And in terms of when you're creating these languages, do you find that there's something, say you're learning Japanese now and you're kind of picking up the way in which a particular language, real-world language is constructed, or you've, I know that having read your blog, you sort of look at old languages and hieroglyphics and these kind of things, and then do you try to work in recent things that you've been looking at into whatever language that you're working on, or is it a case of trying to sort of work within the universe of that fictional world? So, for example, with Dothraki, did you just sort of dump in a few interesting things that you just been kind of looking at, or sort of was there? I don't I don't really know what I'm trying to ask. I'm just trying to ask, I guess.
Well,
where do you put the interesting things that you're looking at? Do you kind of put them into your own personal language projects, or do you try to work them into the sci-fi ones?
Generally, no. So, I mean, because with a language, especially when you're creating a whole thing, I mean, you start first of all, you start way back in time, right? And then you have to evolve it over 1,000, 2,000 years, whatever time frame you give yourself. And so, in a sense, everything that exists in a language is going to be organically created. I mean, you can push things in a certain direction, but even there, it's never my intent to like, oh, this is cool from Japanese, I want to put that in here. It's more what fits for this language. What kind of do I want to do with it? How can I do it so that it makes sense in the context of the system I'm creating? Like, for example, the Castithan language from Defiance. If you look at it kind of with your eyes skewed a little bit, it'll superficially look like Japanese, but grammatically it's very different. There are certain things that you can do in Japanese that you can never do in Castithan, and vice versa, despite the superficial similarities. But it makes sense in both cases, right? Because I mean, the types of things that you can do with Castithan, despite the setup, makes sense given how the Castithan language works. And that type of thing is entirely organic. And so if you try to start to throw in things from other languages, just kind of willy-nilly, it'll end up looking like a hodgepodge, and it won't come out right.
In terms of, I found it interesting that you said you work back over thousands of years. So are you actually trying to create a base for a language and then trying to figure out how it would develop over time? Are you trying to map out in a constructed language the way that a language would organically change?
Yeah, that's exactly what I do. That's exactly what it's called. For language creators, this is called the historical method, where you start with a proto-language, and then evolve it forwards. Like, for example, like English has its roots in a great big proto-language called Proto-Indo-European, which gave birth to all of the Romance languages, all the Slavic languages, all the Germanic languages, and the Indic languages. So usually, for the projects I do, I don't get that kind of time depth. So rather than working from, say, Proto-Indo-European and getting English, it'd be like working from Latin and getting Spanish. Yeah.
I'm kind of interested in your thoughts on things like Esperanto and languages that are constructed but for the goal of becoming a sort of lingua franca or a universal language, or even just a shared secondary language, and then comparing that to perhaps something like Tanglish, or this idea of an organic language that then so happens to become a default second language. So are there benefits to the approach of, if we want to have a shared global language, having a constructed language, or are organically constructed languages more versatile than constructed languages?
the theoretical pro for having a constructed language be the default auxiliary language is that it would be culture neutral. If it was culture neutral, like a language like Esperanto is absolutely not. Nothing could be more Eurocentric. So it never had a chance of being a culture neutral language. So that would be the benefit, but I think that the costs outweigh that benefit. Much easier to just, right now I guess English is pretty much the default, and that's unfortunate because English is again very Eurocentric, but I don't know, it's happening, so whatever, you just kind of throw up your hands and say, well, that'll be, I guess. At this point, I don't see the only language that has a shot of becoming the default auxiliary language for the entire planet is Esperanto, and there's absolutely no chance that that will ever happen. So at this point, I think it's just entirely pointless to create a language specifically with the goal of it becoming the worldwide spoken language. There have been too many contenders, thousands of languages, many much better than Esperanto. But what was that?
I said maybe Klingon.
No,
it's
not a
third place right now.
No, Klingon doesn't have as many words. It's not as recognizable. It's not as easy to pronounce. Though it is super regular, like Esperanto, so very easy to learn. But of course, Klingon wasn't created for international communication, so the point is moot there. But no, I don't see the benefits outweighing the costs for that. So I say we just stick with kind of muddling around and people kind of picking up English, and try our best not to lose the languages that we've got.
In terms of constructing languages, obviously people have been doing this for hundreds of years, and at least as far back as the 1800s, where it was kind of a parlor project for those with a lot of time on their hands. Yeah.
Far back as the 1100s, sorry.
Yeah. Is there a kind of, I don't know if Renaissance is the right word, because I don't feel as though there was ever a time in which many people were constructing languages, but is it maybe a golden age of language construction right now, because you have the internet and you have these large fictional worlds where people like you can actually make a living creating these languages?
I think it's certainly the golden age right now, as far as the attention that's being drawn to language creation and the positive attention that's being drawn to it. I don't think there are necessarily more language creators now than there were 60 years ago. And there have been people creating languages since at least the 12th century. But the internet really changed everything. But that was starting back in 1991. When the first conlanging community formed, whence the term conlang, in fact. It was, that was a really pivotal moment, because for a long time, first of all, language creators, though there were many, they were few and far between, so it was rare for a language creator to meet another in their lifetime, either virtually or even hear of another. They would hear of Tolkien, and once Klingon started getting some press, they would hear of Klingon. But other than that, they could go their whole lives without ever meeting another language creator. And then suddenly in the 90s, the internet started becoming more and more common in the home, with people getting online with CompuServe and then America Online and Prodigy as well. And so that was when the Usenet groups started forming, and people were finding each other, from across the country and across the world, and they started sharing ideas. And that was really where I think that language creation as an art form was born, because you need an audience, and you need to be able to learn from each other. And so that was when it started. But even then, like all the way up until the mid 2000s, or the mid zeros, I guess, if you call that a decade, people still got a lot of negative attention for creating languages. There are lots of people saying that they were stupid, they were crazy, or they were actually, doing something that was malevolent.
Mhm.
Now that it's getting so much positive attention with things like Game of Thrones, I think that's changed. Hopefully for good, but we'll see. If this all fades away and fades out of the public consciousness, it could go underground again. But
Mhm.
for the time being, things are good, and that's really cool.
Yeah, cool. I might end with asking you for a bit of help. So this project that we'll be working on today, it's a bit of a silly project, but the idea is to create a spoken word equivalent of emoji so that people could theoretically read out emoji messages. So there's been what I'm going to try and do by the end of the day is someone created a work called, I don't know if you're familiar with this, Emoji Dick, which was Moby Dick translated using Amazon's Mechanical Turk entirely into emoji. So I'm going to try and create a system that will essentially read this out using the spoken word equivalent. What would be a good starting point for coming up with um, ways to pronounce emoji, and what kind of structure could we have there?
Well, it depends. Do you want a translation or do you want a transcription? And by that I mean, do you just want an audio or an oral way to present exactly which signs are being used in which order, or do you want to translate them back to English?
It would be translating them. It wouldn't be translating them back into English. It would be coming up with an oral equivalent.
Oh, that's easy then. Yeah, just come up with a name for every single one. When I created a language, I'll throw this in here. I created a pictographic language
Hmm.
called X that doesn't have an oral form. But when
Hmm.
I was creating my own dictionary, um, the way that I would do it is every single picture would just have a name. In fact, let's see. Let's see if I can pull this up for you. Yeah. All right. So I'll pull this up for you and screen share this. All right, you seeing it?
Hmm.
Okay, so you see you got a bunch of poorly drawn pictures here, and the part that's in brackets here, that's the name. So like with this symbol here, this is a word for a chapter. You get these three symbols, and the names of them are book, infinity, and stick. And this
Hmm.
little DET thing tells you the position it's in because the first symbol is privileged in this language. That's kind of the base, and these are modifiers called
Hmm.
determiners or determinatives, actually. And so, I mean, this was just something I did just because it made sense when I was creating this. So like, well, I got to have a way to refer to these darn things some way. Right. So I just came up with a name for every single one, and then that's stuck in here. Like so, just to give you an example, here's because I had to alphabetize them in some way too. See, so they're alphabetized by this name, since you can't really alphabetize by picture unless you do stroke count or something, which I wasn't going to do that. So like you see here, here's this little guy that's called the gem determinative, and that's its name. And if you go down to G. Where are we? Oh, I don't have one. Well, you can you can have it with the main. Oh, I know I've got this. All right, so you have heart here as the main one with the infinity determinative, and then you can also use that as a determinative. Where yeah, here's one. So it's the same name. It's just like in this case, it tags it as a determinative. That's because there are two levels of symbology. I think with emoji, there's only one level of symbology. That is, there's just one line, right? And every single symbol is equal status. So you just
Hmm.
have to come up with a unique name for every single one. Hopefully, a one-word name, so it doesn't get too taxing. And then you
Hmm.
can just have it speak it out. It'd be very difficult to process. Probably easier to process the images because, first of all, you can process it at your leisure.
Hmm.
Um, instead of like hearing like smiley, frowny, cloud, block, and so forth. But
Hmm.
yeah, you could do it. Um, You could do it quite
probably
easily.
a practical project, but could be. I think it should be kind of fun.
Yeah. No. Give it a go because I remember they did this. This has kind of happened informally on Twitter with memes. You know,
Mm-hmm.
because often they would just want to say something on Twitter that would be appropriate for a given meme, but they didn't have access to the image, and so they're like, well, how are we going to do this? So it's like what was one? Well, I don't think Fry is in more than one meme. Actually, yeah, he is. He's in, Shut Up and Take My Money, and then he's also in the Fry that narrows his eyes.
Yeah.
So it's like they were trying to come up with ways so you could uniquely identify those memes and just refer to them in words so that you could tweet stuff for them. So yeah, it could be worthwhile.
It could be, it might not be, but I won't spend too long on it. But
yeah. If you wanted to get really clever, what you could do is instead of identifying them with words that were obvious, you could actually just use letter and number combinations. So like X1, X2, X3, X4. It'd be a second level of encoding that you have to memorize, but you get through it a lot quicker.
It's interesting. I don't want to rely on English. I want it to be, so I don't want to tie it to any specific base existing language.
No, you're absolutely in trouble. No. You're absolutely far gone there. No, it has to rely on a language. Otherwise, how is it going to make any sense?
Well, that's a good question. That's what I'm asking you. But I suppose I don't want you to be reading out, for example, smiley face or screaming cat or something like that. So I want it to be something somewhat more flexible. So I suppose X1, X2 at least has the benefit of not relying on you being an English speaker so much, at least. Perhaps.
Yeah, except then you have to rely on the English pronunciations of the letters and the numbers. So, yeah. Of course,
okay.
the whole point with the emoji is that they're universal, right? So it seems like you're going to need independent localizations if you want to do an audio form, because there is no such thing as oral iconicity. That's the thing that the visual medium buys you, iconicity, and that's the thing that's absolutely and totally lacking in the oral medium, unless every single thing had its own unique sound. So like rather than saying a word for cat or saying X4 for cat, you hear a meow. It's hard, though, to imagine what iconic sound would apply to somebody smiling, somebody frowning, somebody, I don't know, like a cloud, like the various emojis they got. But that would be the only way you could do it.
I think that might be the approach, though I think that could be tricky. But I think that maybe maps onto the idea of emoji being used as sort of auxiliary to the language the person's using. So it's kind of as sort of exclamation or to reflect some kind of emotional state. So maybe if I can come up with an oral equivalent to that. But there are some very tricky ones, so it's going to be interesting to see whether I can do this. But yeah, we'll see how we go, I suppose.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me about all of this. It's been really fascinating.
Yeah, no problem. And
Cool.
good luck with your project. And if there was anybody watching, thanks for watching.
Yeah, I'll send you the link. So we'll pop it up on a blog as well. Great.
Nice.
Thanks, David.
All right.